right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I think a few people are still joining us for today's webinar, but we'll go ahead and get things underway. So hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar on education and resilience in crisis, challenges and opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is also the title of our new book, which I'm holding right here, published by Bristol University Press. My name is Mary Mendenhall, and I am a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City, and also one of the co-editors of this book, along with Gautier Marché, Youssef Syed, and Neil Boothby, and many others that we'll get to in a moment. And just so you can see here, here's the plan for today's webinar, which includes a short overview of the BRiCE initiative that the studies presented in the book address, brief highlights about why we wrote this book, and then key findings across the 4 research studies, which will be presented by the lead researchers for each project, and will culminate with cross-study reflections and concluding remarks. And last but not least, we're also joined by a colleague from Uganda who will share his practitioner's response. So we plan to have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, but we welcome your questions and comments throughout. We would just kindly ask you to use the Q&A function to capture those questions and not the chat box, though feel free to pass along your greetings to each other in that space. So in terms of BRiCE, which stands for the Building Resilience and Crises Through Education Initiative, this initiative was funded by the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships. Each consortium, 4 in total, engaged local, national, and international partners to implement education programming aimed to support teachers, students, and communities in crisis-affected contexts, along with research projects facilitated by independent researchers aimed to gain an understanding of the challenges they face. And the lead NGOs for each consortium, which you can see on the slides here, were the Norwegian Refugee Council, Oxfam IBIS, Save the Children, and Plan International. The studies took place across 7 different sub-Saharan African contexts. So briefly, in terms of the overview of the book, the goals of the co-edited book aim to bring together findings from 4 interdisciplinary and mixed method studies that were conducted over a period of 3 or 4 years. Moving away from deficit models, we aspire to learn more about how learners, teachers, and school staff persevere amidst violence, persecution, marginalization, and poverty as a result of often protracted and overlapping armed conflict, displacement, and during this period of time, the COVID-19 health pandemic. The introductory chapter to the book spends some time examining the relationship between education and different types of crises and its implications for schooling. It explores and problematizes the concepts of resilience, well-being, and inclusion, which are at the heart of each of the research studies. And we reflect on the opportunities and challenges of conducting research in crisis contexts, including some of the disconnects in the time horizons of practitioners compared to researchers, as well as some of the coordination challenges that arise between different types of organizations and people working in these spaces. We aim to share these challenges as well as the successes that can emerge from these approaches, in hopes that it will inform a range of stakeholders working in and or interested in education and emergencies and related fields. So at the outset, I want to recognize the contributing authors to the different chapters that make up this volume that you see here on the slide. Additionally, there are more than 140 practitioners and researchers who contributed to the various research studies led by the different NGOs, and an even greater number of learners, teachers, school leaders, and community members who ultimately contributed to the success of the independent research studies conducted as part of the BRiCE initiative. So with that, I'd like to introduce another co-editor and lead researcher, Dr. Neil Boothby, from the Global Center for the Development of the Whole Child at Notre Dame University, to share findings from the study that he led. And so Neil, yeah, please unmute and over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and greetings, everyone. So we began this adventure with great excitement. The idea of a 4-year longitudinal study in crisis context was unique, a unique contribution from the EU. And our original questions were sort of crafted in collaboration with the AEP Accelerated Education Program Working Group. And they were particularly interested in how successful are AEPs in integrating student learners into formal education or vocational education. And secondly, to what extent are AEPs successful in reaching out and including and keeping the most marginalized children in these programs? You can look on the screen here. We pursued kind of a mixed methods 4-year period comparisons between the refugee students in Tanzania with the sort of internally displaced students in the DRC, their experiences before and during. We had interviews with parents and caretakers. We had a teacher observational tool, and we looked at literacy and numeracy scores, et cetera. What happened, if you look on the screen here, is we started with 839 learners in the two situations, and by the next year, only 343 were still in the program. And given that high attrition rate, it was difficult to continue with the particular way that we were pursuing things. So we actually created a second cohort, large numbers. But by the next year, we found the similar, if not greater, attrition rates or dropout rates. So if you look at 2020, only 153 of the original 839 were still in the program. Now, some of those out of Tanzania repatriated, so that's a neutral issue, and some transferred into formal schools, which is a good sign, but the vast majority dropped out. So we kind of flipped the script, so to speak, and we started looking at the question of resilience or persistence. We kind of landed on academic persistence, because persistence is an SEL skill that we sometimes integrate into our education programs. And resilience, we were not able to really tap into any of the psychosocial issues that might be highly correlated with resilience. So we looked at persistence. Why did a minority of students remain in schools when the majority did not? And that became sort of the central question. Mary, if we go to the next slide, please. So here in a nutshell are kind of what we found. And there's kind of a converse correlation between persistence and dropping out. So one thing was when we looked at the backgrounds of these student learners, we found, previous, the time spent in school before they dropped out, and also the idea that those school experiences were relatively positive, was correlated with either staying in, persisting, or dropping out. And to some extent, if students, these youth were in school for less than 3 years, it really was kind of an early warning sign. So I think in the future, we need to kind of get that background information and realize that those students may be more at risk for dropping out. Probably the biggest factor was poverty or the home environment and how they navigated those realities. So students that stayed in school, their parents and fathers also, if there was a man in the household, played a pretty important role. They kind of valued education. We saw education as a pathway forward, but also they helped their students balance school and work responsibilities. All these students have work responsibilities, chores, or engaging in the informal, economic sector. And it wasn't that the students that stayed in did not have those responsibilities or chores, but it's their parents helped them navigate that. Whereas dropping out, there was less parent support for that. Individual characteristics, motivation and persistence, the students that stayed in did have and spoke about education in a positive way. And again, they saw it as a pathway forward. They saw it as a valued entity. But the link between parents encouraging them and individual motivation, you couldn't really separate those two variables. On the leaving AEP side, you're seeing that sort of limited classroom size, materials, et cetera. I would say the key role of the teachers had more to do with relationships than it did with the way they taught academic subjects. So it was, if a student was absent from school and the teacher visited the home and found out why and whatnot, connection with the families, rewarding effort rather than test scores was highly valued. I guess in sum, if AEPs are really to contribute to resilience building in crisis contexts, they're going to need to take into account the living realities of student learners, not just classroom or academic components. And co-location of food security, livelihood support, or school meal programs, I think would have cut these attrition rates significantly. We have evidence from other contexts that school meal programs are highly correlated not only with attendance, but also with academic achievement. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. And as you can tell, we're going to move fairly swiftly through the 4 kind of core chapters of the book related to the 4 different studies. So, feel free to post your questions about those studies as we go, and then hopefully we'll, come up with some questions that connect the different studies and engage all of us in conversation. So just a friendly reminder to use the Q&A function for that. So now we're going to pivot to the next study, and I'm actually here with Doctors Danny Falk and Daniel Shepard, who were doctoral students at the time of this study, but who are now wonderful colleagues and friends. And so the study portrayed in our chapter, which was part of the Oxfam-led consortium, sought to ask, what are the most salient aspects of well-being for teachers and learners in Palabek, Uganda, and Juba and Torit, South Sudan? And in what ways do teacher and learner well-being interact with one another and with the broader community? And this study was a mixed methods, multi-site and cross-border study, looking at a similar population moving between the 2 countries that took place over 4 years. And through our approach, we were keen to examine learner and teacher well-being together and not as separate entities. And to better understand how learners and teachers define and conceptualize well-being and resilience for themselves. And we were also interested in understanding what about the context mattered and mattered most for studying well-being and resilience, and did this through a socio-ecological approach. And these efforts resulted in what we called the 3R ecological model, which represents the components, connections, and contextual realities that influence teacher and learner well-being, and which Danny is going to describe in more detail.
Thanks so much, Mary. You can see our framework on the right side of the slide. And in the center of the framework, we've identified roles, relationships, and resources as these central components that intersect to influence well-being. By roles, we mean the professional and personal identities that teachers and learners take on in relation to themselves as well as to others. By relationships, we mean the individual and group networks, interactions, and bonds that teachers and learners form and take a part in. And by resources, we mean both the physical and financial capital that teachers and learners have access to. We also recognize that it's important to understand these 3 components across teachers and learners' homes, schools, and communities, as they are central places where role fulfillment, relationship enactment, and resource access play out. And so this can be seen at the bottom of the conceptual framework and highlights again sort of our socio-ecological framing. Further, these places, the home, school, and community, need to be understood within the sociocultural and geopolitical environment, as the broader context influences the roles teachers and learners take on, as well as how teachers and learners think about and conceptualize their roles, the relationships they form, and their ability to access resources. And so the underlying causes and variables contributing to ongoing crises, which we know are complex and often compounding, and the policy environment are included on each of the sides of the conceptual framework. And all of this comes together in an effort to fill the various needs which appear on the top of the conceptual framework, ranging from physical to spiritual, which when filled or not help to support or hinder learner and teacher well-being. And I'll turn it over to Daniel now to talk a little bit more in depth about some of our findings.
Thank you, Mary and Danny. So in addition to some of the framing of the bullets on your screen, I want to highlight some of the key findings and implications from our chapter. So the first is that intersectoral programming is really critical for understanding and responding to the needs of this community, in particular education, food, housing, and water. These are necessary to support success in school, and also what is necessary to support that success is teachers need to be paid adequate salaries, and learners need to be able to cover their basic needs. Second, we must keep teachers and their well-being at the center of education policy in and out of crises. Teachers play a key relational role in the lives of their learners. And when teachers are not well, there are significant implications at the individual, school, and systems level. Teacher well-being is core to building resilient, equitable, and effective education systems. And although we found in our study that teachers derive great meaning from supporting their students who go through difficulties, for example, teachers with students who have more limited resources felt stronger role fulfillment, this comes at a price and increases their levels of stress and difficulty as a teacher in their own life as well beyond the classroom. And as a result, providing sufficient resources to teachers often requires engaging other personnel, such as paraprofessionals or social workers, so teachers can focus more on their instructional practices. To put it bluntly, teachers with more resources are better equipped to support learners. Efforts to improve and strengthen teacher and learner well-being and resilience cannot be separated from these larger contextual realities highlighted by the conceptual framework. And designing educational approaches, we need to consider the roles, that is the professional and personal identities that teachers and learners take on, as expressed by Danny, the relationships, that is individual and group networks and interactions, and the resources, both physical and financial, that are needed to cover the basic needs of teachers and learners. And when we're incorporating learners and teachers' perspectives in context, we need to really understand how the context is affecting their ability to succeed as teachers and as learners, and their ability to be well, both in terms of their feeling and functioning. This engagement with learners and teachers' perspectives in context highlights a tension between our field's desire for generic models that can be applied anywhere and the need for contextually appropriate responses that understand the lived realities of teachers and learners. So thank you for listening. And with that, I'll pass it to Gauthier Moshe for the next study.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Professor Samuel Matabishi of the Institut Supérieur Pédagogique de Bukavu. I'm Gauthier from the Institute of Development Studies, and we'll be talking about our study, which was part of the consortium led by Save the Children. So the study covered a range of themes, but in this chapter, we focus on the important question of violence against teachers in DRC and Niger. Violence against teachers has received relatively little attention as compared to violence against education and schools more broadly. And the study asked, what are the causes of violence against teachers? What are the effects of violence on teachers' well-being, and how do teachers deal with violence in schools? And we use an interdisciplinary and mixed methods approach. There was a qualitative and quantitative component. We followed several hundreds of teachers over 4 years in both the DRC, specifically in the province of South Kivu, and Niger, the regions of Difa and Zander. And the approach was also very much centered on teachers. And actually, we had teachers who are currently teaching in conflict-affected zones as part of the research team. So as part of the survey, we embedded trauma-sensitive recall methods through which we were able to ascertain the level of exposure to violence of teachers. And we found that in the DRC, 37% of teachers and 4% in Niger experienced at least one direct physical attack in their lives. This is a significant number that shows that violence against teachers is generally underreported. And in the case of Niger, we actually think that the figure is higher at the moment with the increase of violence in Niger, particularly in the Tillabéri and Difa regions. We also explored the causes of violence against teachers, which we summarize in this chapter, and we find three overarching causes. First, the position of schools and teachers in violent political economies, whereby teachers and schools are targeted by armed actors for extortion, but armed actors also interfere in the governance of schools, which can lead to violence. The second is the targeting of teachers for identity and social position related reasons in conjunction with the social transformation that happens in societies as a result of war. So teachers can be targeted for their status as states representatives, because of their ethno-linguistic or religious identities when these are politically salient, or other components of their identity when these are salient, or because of social jealousy against their perceived status as elites or intellectuals in societies, which can channel violence against them. And finally, the third overarching cause is the militarization of everyday school level tensions, which exist in any school, but in contexts where there is the implantation of armed actors can lead to violence spilling out of school, basically. So we also looked at the consequences of violence against teachers, and here I put a figure from our measures of PTSD among teachers. We found high levels of PTSD among teachers, and somewhat unsurprisingly, we found that teachers exposed to violence have higher levels of PTSD, which is expected, but yet very important to document and also understand the nature and consequences of this trauma. I will pass to Professor Samuel Matabishi, who will be speaking in French, but I will be summarizing what he said just after in English. Professeur Samuel Matabishi, si vous voulez entrer. Professeur Matabishi, vous nous entendez? Professeur Matabishi, vous nous entendez? Je pense que...
Allô?
Oui, allez-y, si vous voulez.
Connexion.
Oh. Professeur, je ne sais pas, c'est peut-être un problème de connexion. Dans ce cas-là, je peux reprendre vos points et on peut y revenir pendant la discussion plus tard. All right, so I think we have some connection issues. What I will do is summarize the points that Samuel Matabishi was going to make, and we can come back and hopefully the connection will be better for the discussion and Samuel Matabishi can intervene. So in terms of the consequences, notions such as trauma and PTSD are socially and culturally situated. They cannot necessarily be deployed in these types of contexts where trauma is experienced in different ways. And this is something that Samuel Matabishi was going to elaborate upon, the ways in which teachers express their experience of this trauma by finding that they have a tired head and various manifestations of extreme stress and fatigue as they work. It's also important to bear in mind that teachers in such contexts are dealing with past traumas, which might be tied to exposure to violence, but in context of ongoing and active threats against them, which makes it obviously particularly difficult. And they are also dealing with the ways in which polarized societies, polarized by violent conflict, and these dynamics enter the school environment and make for tense classrooms. Another aspect that we studied is how teachers deal with violence, whether or not, for example, they discuss violence in the classroom. We found that this is very difficult in Niger. Teachers told us that it's very difficult in Niger where teachers said that it's impossible to pronounce the name, for example, of Boko Haram. In the DRC, we found varying practices, with some teachers deciding not to talk about the violent conflict at all with their students because it was too dangerous. Others actually decided to talk with their students on the basis of educating them to their history and conscientizing them to the realities that surround them. We found a central rule of religion as a heuristic and as a way in which teachers deal with violence, prominently Christianity in the DRC and Islam in Niger, but also other religions beyond those. And Professor Samuel Matabishi, who is a sociolinguist of education, looked at the linguistic coping strategies employed by teachers from minority ethno-linguistic groups, such as hiding their mother tongues. Finally, we developed a teacher training module which builds on the work of ISP Bukavu and builds on our research results, which aims to equip teachers with the pedagogical tools to deal with violence in the classroom environment, and which is currently being scaled up by ISP Bukavu to be incorporated in the national curriculum of teacher training institutes in the DRC. And I will pass over to Yusuf, I believe, for the third study. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautier. So I'm going to talk about the fourth study, and this just a bit of context behind the study. The study was conducted with the refugee community in Gambela in Ethiopia, and the refugee community was largely from Sudan, and so were the teachers largely, and in Puntland in Somalia. And while the book chapter focuses primarily on teachers and their views around professional development, the larger study did use a mixed method study to look at several things, not just about teachers, but also about learning. In particular, it sought to understand what students in both contexts, that is Ethiopia and Somalia, learned, both in terms of what we call cognitive learning in literacy and numeracy, as well as social cohesion. But in relation to teachers, the primary focus was on what they benefited from professional development and also what they understood about the context. And like all the other studies, this was a study over about 3 years in which we worked with teachers across multiple years. In Gambela, the work was done led by the University of Gambela, while in Puntland, Somalia, it was the Puntland Development and Research Center. If we move to the next slide, the next slide simply summarizes the key findings and the key takeaways from what we know about teacher professional development for those teachers working in context of refugee camps or those teachers working with internally displaced populations, as in Somalia. And so it wouldn't be surprising to find that there was significant variation in coverage and depth of CPD across both contexts. And this variation was partly explained by who provided it, partly the role of institutional governance and school-level governance in terms of supporting teachers' uptake of CPD, as well as the workloads of teachers themselves. Not surprisingly, when CPD was provided, teachers did find it useful and they expressed satisfaction with the need for CPD. However, what was significant in the finding was two key findings that emerged. The first was that teachers often found that they were not involved significantly in not only identifying the needs, but designing the kinds of CPD that they required. As such, it was largely supplier-driven models of CPD. Further, teachers identified strongly the need for CPD that went beyond the traditional model to CPD that was focused on the classrooms and focused on their needs. In this respect, in the context of both Somalia and Ethiopia, teachers argued very strongly for pedagogical training and CPD support to understand and address the impact on violence on their learners and displacement on the learners who were displaced in Somalia, and how they managed to talk about violent conflict. One of the key takeaways from the report was that CPD and professional development, not only is it crucial that teachers are involved in both the design and in terms of the form, but it's crucial that it's aligned to teacher working conditions. And I think it wouldn't surprise many attending this that incentive teacher pay or the structure of how teachers are paid in both contexts had an adverse effect on teachers. Thus, we discovered a significant churn and change and transition of teachers in both contexts because the incentive to remain longer was less. More importantly, the need for alignment with working conditions was not only about what they needed for the school and the classroom context, but also had to manage in relation to the other conditions of work, such as the environments they worked in, the salaries that they receive, or rather the incentive payments they receive, and the long-term career progression that was afforded to them. As such, many of the teachers in the larger study spoke about the need of temporality of their contracts, reducing their incentive and motivation to acquire CPD. I think those are the key takeaways about providing CPD and teachers' views about CPD in crisis and forced displacement context in Ethiopia and Somalia. I'll pass over, I think it's to Gauthier and Mary.
Thanks a lot, Yusuf. So on behalf of the editors and the authors of this book, I'm going to share a few final reflections, which are part of the conclusions of the book, which are broader than these points. The first point is about the importance of conducting research in crisis contexts. We believe that the book itself and the studies that underpin the book demonstrate that it is feasible to conduct rigorous and ethical research in crisis-affected contexts, despite the big challenges that this represents in terms of logistics, in terms of methodology, in terms of ethics, and a range of things. This, we believe, is important, and we urge and encourage more research on these types of contexts, because these obstacles to research in these types of contexts have led to little research on such contexts, which is problematic because it leads to further marginalization of these contexts, and it hinders an understanding of the realities that teachers and learners face in such contexts. So we believe that it's very important. Additionally, the crises which are covered in this book are severe, they are protracted, they are continuing in time. Increasingly, they are interconnected, and in today's world, unfortunately, they are amplifying. So their effects on teachers and learners and education systems will also be amplifying. So we believe it's urgent and important to continue doing research on these types of contexts. In order to do so, it's important to develop research tools that are adapted to contexts of crises and remain rigorous and ethical. Many methodological approaches are difficult to apply in these types of contexts. We can think about the question of attrition, for example. It's difficult to conduct statistical studies and various other studies when there are high levels of attrition, but that is a reality in these types of contexts. There is displacement. It's the reality of the education systems and of the teachers in these types of contexts. So we believe that methods and methodologies should apply to the context and not the other way around. So there is a key importance of methodological innovation, adaptation, while ensuring rigor, ethics, and inclusion. Another important point that came out through the various presentations and is one of the conclusions of this book is the importance of approaches that are centered on learners and teachers, which in many cases requires to adopt non-dominant and non-standard understandings or conceptualizations of education. If you take many of the concepts that are, let's say, prominent in international education or education in emergencies, such as teaching quality, for example, these are terms and notions that still largely rest on standardized and, to be honest, Western-centric conceptions of education, and they might not be suited to understand these crisis contexts. They might not be relevant in these types of contexts. This is tied to what was said before about deficit approaches, which tend to say a lot about what those contexts aren't and little about what they are indeed. So we believe it is urgent to develop approaches that are based on learners and teachers, as was done in this study. For example, the conceptualization of teacher well-being that was done in chapter 2 by Mary and her colleagues. It's also important to do so because teachers, educators, education administrators, people who work on education in these types of contexts have extremely valuable knowledge about these contexts and education in these contexts, which sounds very obvious, but is very important to bear in mind. Teachers and educators have the best understanding of the challenges that they face in such contexts, and they often have key insights on how to address them. This constitutes knowledge, it constitutes expertise, but it's an expertise and a knowledge that has consistently been disregarded in educational approaches as a result of knowledge hierarchies that might exist in state education systems or international education projects and partnerships as well. So it's very important to center this expertise and knowledge of the teachers and the educators themselves, and this requires time, a deep engagement with these teachers and educators, and meaningful and partnerships and collaborations as well. Another conclusion that comes out strongly of this book is the importance of intersectional approaches. Because these crises are complex, because they are multi-layered, multifaceted, and they are protracted, it's important they affect many aspects of educators, teachers, and learners' lives. And as a result, it is important to think about intersectoral approaches, such as incorporating mental health and psychosocial support in education interventions, which is increasingly done, but still relatively, I would say, not systematically so. Economic components are also very important, notably supporting teachers' salaries in times of acute crisis. This can provide a lifeline in times of extreme financial hardship or extreme crises. It's very important as well. Or embedding social assistance and social protection with education interventions and education projects. Cross-border coordination and collaboration is also very important because there are a lot of cross-border dynamics. These are crises that go across borders. So there needs to be regional understandings and regional approaches and framings of these questions. So to finish up, we really hope that this book will help and be useful to students, educators, practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and everyone and anyone who works on education in crisis-affected contexts. It's important to bear in mind that this is a book that is based on human experience. We are a large team of researchers across these 4 consortia that have worked on this issue over 4 years. And we witnessed teachers, learners, NGO workers, state officials, state administrators, who, despite the severe crisis that they are experiencing, continue to learn and teach and make the education sector function in these types of contexts and carry the education systems on their shoulder, often at the cost of their own well-being, and we believe that they should be supported. On that note, I will pass it on to Okello Francis Amodo. Thank you.
Thanks, Gauthier. I'm going to introduce him briefly, but thanks, Gauthier. And so those are the highlights from the 4 different studies and the specific research questions that are highlighted in the book. And I think as academics and researchers, we have been uncharacteristically succinct today, and we're a bit ahead of schedule, which is a good place to be. We'll have more time for discussion in a moment. But before we get to that, I'd like to introduce our practitioners response portion of today's webinar. So Daniel and I had the pleasure of collaborating with our next speaker during the BRiCE project. Okello Francis Amoto was working with one of Oxfam's partner organizations, ABSI Uganda, in Palabek settlement in the north. He is now with the Refugee Law Project at Makerere University, providing education support in Kirandongo settlement in Uganda. And we invited Francis to share his practitioner's perspective, of course, informed by the time with the Oxfam-led consortium, but also across the 4 studies that he was listening to today. So thanks so much for being with us, Francis. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Just like Mary introduced me, I am Francis Okello Amoto. I'm currently working with the Refugee Law Project. This is a project of the School of Law in Makerere University in Uganda. I am based in Kirandongo Refugee Settlement, a settlement that hosts 119,000 refugees across different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. We have refugees from the DRC, we have refugees from Sudan, we have refugees from South Sudan, we have refugees from Chad, we have refugees from Rwanda, and then Burundi. So it is a unique kind of settlement where I am currently based. And it is a place where people from across different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa come seeking safety, stability, and opportunity because of the friendly refugee policy in the country. I had the privilege of working with the Oxfam-led BRiCE consortium in Uganda. I was with AFSI Foundation in Uganda in Palabek Refugee Settlement. And it is a pleasure for me to share my experience as a practitioner in engaging with education in emergencies. My intervention in the BRiCE consortium was for the 4 years of the project. I was there from the very beginning up to the end. So I will share my experience based on the interaction for the 4 years. Gladly, the research component was also conducted within the 4 years of the project. And so I was part of it from the very beginning up to the end. I can tell you that when you are on the ground, in the classroom or in the community where the persons of concern are, you see things very clearly. You see that teachers are at the heart of rebuilding communities, rebuilding education, rebuilding their families. And so this means looking at the researches that were conducted and now combined in this book, Education and Resilience in Crisis, Challenges and Opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa. I agree with the findings here. As a practitioner, I've been down on the ground to see how these things were done. Our teachers are the unsung heroes that nobody talks about them, but they hold up, they hold up their learners, their families, their communities, but to realize that they carry an enormous burden. And this burden is to do with the vicarious trauma that teachers go through. Because of dealing with challenges that learners go through, they deal with challenges that communities, the parents go through, and also the challenges that the education system goes through. And this puts them at risk of suffering a vicarious trauma, which greatly affects their well-being. You realize that there are students who witness violence from their closest relatives to their parents, and others experience the violence themselves. And so when they come, it is teachers to, at the center of ensuring they manage all this situation. In the end, they end up being greatly affected by all this. Parents have a heap of challenges that they go through within the settlements. You realize that parents are grappling with issues to do with livelihoods, and many times they tend to prioritize livelihood to education. And so teachers will have to struggle and convince them that when you educate your child, it can be a turning point in the family. They can, open many doors. And so all this wrapped up is heaped on the teacher. And yet these same teachers are expected to keep showing up in spite of the, the challenges. Somebody talked about issues of dropout. I personally was at the center of implementation of accelerated education in Palabek refugee settlement, and realized that the trend that has been put in the research that was conducted in DR Congo is not different from what we experience here in Uganda. You realize there is very high dropout rate among the AEP learners. It is the same thing in the formal basic primary schools. Dropout rates are very high. Reasons are very much similar. In Palabek lies at the border with South Sudan. And so there is back and forth movement of refugees. When things are not doing well in the settlement, they tend to run back home. And again, when they experience hardships there, they run back. So you realize that the enrollment, the dropout, what we call dropout here, it keeps, fluctuating like that. And so it is a similar scenario here in Uganda. I believe elsewhere, apart from DR Congo and Niger, where AEP was also implemented, there are probably similar experiences to do with dropout, which shows level of resilience, and teachers are here at the center of ensuring that they improve this trend to ensure that the resilience level can rise up. What this book, Education and Resilience in Crisis, reminds us about is that research really matters. As a practitioner, I have seen the interaction that we had in the BRiCE project here was very much informed by research. For example, we were implementing a CPD component, which in Uganda and South Sudan, we called it Teacher Educator Professional Development, TEPD, which was informed by research. Now, our partner, Luigi Gusani Institute of Higher Education, had to adapt the INE Teacher in Crisis Context module to suit the context. And that would not be done if it were not because of research. So the research that were conducted helped the partner that was in charge with the development of the CPD modules to adapt the content to the context in Uganda and South Sudan. In Uganda, we have not experienced so much attacks on teachers like it is the case in Niger or DR Congo. But of course, many of the teachers who are refugees may have experienced violence from their own countries, like South Sudan and DR Congo. It challenges us to look deeper beyond the usual approaches of baseline and endline evaluations. And I think there is need to do a rigorous research as part of every project that targets education in emergencies. That way, we will be able to tailor our interventions that are in a way that will be able to respond to the need of the learners, the teachers, and the community at large. Because less than that, we will just be doing the routine while not realizing the power that research can, the contribution that research can bring to the implementation of education in emergencies. We need to get solutions that recognize teachers' well-being, as this is central. Because of research, our teacher-educator professional development component that we use in Uganda and also in South Sudan, we're targeting these areas to do with teachers' well-being, learners' well-being, psychosocial support, alongside the pedagogy element that is normally the case in most situations. And so it helped to improve things a lot, to an extent that teachers who were in the government schools outside the settlement were like, why don't you bring all this to us? But of course, as you know, projects are always limited. The most salient component of the TPD that we had in Uganda was the teacher learning cycle. The teacher learning cycle is a model where teachers are trained, and then we recognize the fact that even when people are trained, not everyone understands at the same level. And so because of that, those who understood a component of a training very well supports the other, and they form what we call teacher learning cycle, so that after the project is gone, the project can actually be able to continue in another form. And so I think, thank you, Mary, for the reminder. I think this is the interplay that we have between research and implementation of education in emergencies. So my message is this to everyone: let's shift the paradigm. Let's embrace research that goes beyond surface level matrices. Let's listen to the voices on the ground, the teachers, the stakeholders, the learners, parents, and give them the tools they need to heal and to thrive and rebuild. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francis, for sharing those reflections. And you both kind of surfaced some additional nuance from the different projects, and specifically the Oxfam-led project. And it was really helpful to hear your thoughts. And I hope you'll stay with us for the discussion portion that we're going to move into in a moment as well. And so, yeah, at this point, we're going to move pretty quickly into the Q&A portion. We've seen some great questions coming in, so keep them coming. Just a couple final points we'd like to make here. First of all, we invite you to scan the QR code that you see on your screen, where you can find more details about the book and its availability in hardback, in e-publication, or Kindle versions through Bristol University Press. I posted the link a couple times in the chat, and I'll do it again in a moment. And then I'm going to move through these slides quickly so we can get to the discussion. But I also take, and I think all of us take note of the comments in the chat box, right, about the challenges of maybe purchasing the book. And so there are other open access and free resources that were also generated through some of the different studies. And you can't probably read all the fine print on the slide that you see here, but there are some different reports, case studies, kind of small and large resources that you might also be interested in. So feel free to reach out, feel free to do a screenshot of this or just email us directly. I'm going to share our emails in a moment if you'd like to see any of these items. And then here are the contacts for myself and for Gautier, Youssef, and Neil. So if there are also questions that come up that we don't get to that you'd like to follow up with, or if you'd like to request any resources, you have this information. And I'll post those emails in the chat box as well in just a moment. So we are ahead of schedule, which is a good thing. That means we've got lots of time for Q&A and discussion. So we're gonna move to that now. I will actually stop sharing my screen and we can see more faces in a moment. But yeah, let's go ahead and pivot to that. I'll stop sharing my screen here. All right. And maybe Lauren, you can help me pin our speakers. And hopefully we've got Samuel back, and I think we lost, oh no, Francis is still here, wonderful. Great. Okay, so I'm gonna pose a few questions for folks to answer. Actually, Gautier and Samuel, can we start with you? Julia, and hi Julia, asked a question about the research in DRC. She wanted to know which provinces the research was conducted in. And also, was there any exploration into the mental health and psychosocial needs of learners and their likelihood to drop out? So Gautier, I don't know if you want to translate first for Samuel, and then we invite your reflections.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I mean, we're happy to answer all the questions that are related to the DRC component. Samuel Matabishi, il y a une question pour nous. C'est dans notre recherche sur quelle province de la RDC s'est focalisée l'étude, et avons-nous exploré la question de la santé mentale et des besoins psychosociaux des élèves et leur propension à quitter l'école, ce qui n'est pas quelque chose qu'on a regardé spécifiquement. Donc, je peux répondre en anglais, et si vous voulez intervenir après, n'hésitez pas. Ou alors, allez-y, si vous voulez intervenir, allez-y.
Non, d'abord, excusez-moi parce que j'ai perdu ma connexion. Quand je devais intervenir, ça m'attriste, je suis très triste de ça. Cette question, on ne l'a pas beaucoup explorée. Ça, il faut vraiment le reconnaître. Mais je vais vous laisser peut-être continuer. Je pourrai revenir après.
Très bien. So yes,
Oui, allô, Gautier?
Oui, bien reçu. Merci beaucoup, professeur. Professor Samuel Matabishi excused himself for losing the connection earlier on when he was supposed to intervene. But with regards to the DRC, the study took place in South Kivu, and specifically two territories of Uvira and Fizi, which are among the most conflict affected of Eastern DRC. In this specific study, BRiCE studied, we did not look at the mental health and psychosocial needs of learners. Specifically, we really focused on teachers for this one, but we have associated studies that put more focus on the mental health and psychosocial needs of learners. I can put some links, or please feel free to contact me on my email. I can send those through. I'll reply quickly to the question on the DRC that is a bit further down, so that we can move on to other panelists. So with regards to who committed violence against teachers, thanks, Julia Jonah, for your question. It's a range. It's a range of people and dynamics of violence at play. Armed actors, broadly, I would say, are the main people conducting violence against teachers, and this includes armed groups, so non-state armed groups, but also criminal groups, gangs, criminal organizations, various types of bandits. And there are really several logics at play. Extortion is a prominent one, extortion of schools and teachers. But they can also be targeted for various facets of their identity, for example, belonging to an ethno-linguistic minority when that is a source of tension in the region. In some cases, for example, in Niger, they are targeted directly by armed actors for ideological reasons, because education is, at least state education conceived as Western, is an object of basically the violent conflict itself. But we developed these results we have a much more advanced version of this causes of violence against teachers component of the study, which will be published as an article shortly. There is a version that is available on ResearchGate. We just updated it, so I need to update it again, but I can send you versions directly. Please feel free to contact me and we will put that online, open access.
Great. Thanks, Gautier. And sorry, I was mixing up and not paying attention to questions and studies. So Neil, Julia's first question was actually for you. So maybe you want to come in here about which provinces the research was conducted in, and any mental research on mental health and psychosocial needs of learners and their likelihood to drop out.
Sure. So thanks for the questions, Julia. So the district was North Kivu, and the particular area was Rwenzori, where most of the research took place. We did attempt to explore some of the psychosocial mental health issues. We took baseline information on student learners using CYRM, which is Children and Youth Resilience Measures. So we're able to get a baseline, but because of the high attrition rates, we were not able to sort of get end lines. So with enough sort of statistical significance to make that valuable. What we can say, however, is that kind of past experiences, whether you were exposed to violence against family members or separation from family, for example, there really wasn't correlation or significant differences between kids that stayed in school and those that didn't. So that's about as far as we could answer that particular question.
Great. And maybe Neil, while you're at it, I'm going to squeeze in a question from Emma.
Okay.
She talked about recognizing that research shows that students lack resources to stay in AEP. Did any of the programs include CVA, cash and voucher assistance? Or do you have specific recommendations on the use of that resource in AEP programs going forward and how this might help and bolster resilience?
Well, Emma, again, thank you for that question. There was not CVAs used in either context. There were seeds and tools that were distributed to communities in the DRC. However, when we interviewed families of students in the AEP program, none of those families were able to identify receiving those resources. So if they did in fact take place, they were not necessarily co-located with the school population, the students that were going there. My question, I think cash, CVAs are a great resource in a general sense. My question would be, if it wasn't tied, if it wasn't conditional to education, would it make a difference or not? And I neutrally don't know that answer. I do know that in the past, there's programs where there have been conditional cash transfers tied to education that did produce some significant results in terms of attendance and persisting in school. There also is quite a bit of evidence that school feeding programs, that meal programs, are highly correlated with attendance, and to some extent in India, for example, where they have the largest largest school feeding program in the world, to not only attendance but also academic achievement. Now, those contexts aren't equal, but it does show the results. I go way back in time in a Kakuma camp where IRC once a week would offer a dried fish to girls who came to school, and attendance rates went up 80%. So something as simple as that, in that particular refugee context, made a difference. So I think CBAs are a great tool. My question would be, would it in fact, unless it was linked conditionally to education, would it in fact be used for that? I don't know, but there's other more specific interventions that have been tied to sort of persistence in school. Mary, if we just go down to Jen's question, and then I'll get out of your way because she's also asking that of you. If I'm not mistaken, you're asking questions about sort of gender dynamics. So in the studies that we did, there were some differences. For example, in the DRC, dropout female students that didn't stay in the program, that dropped out, did with some frequency cite safety issues coming from home to schools. This was a context in which there were guerrilla groups and gangs that were holding people hostage, that were extorting money out of community members and whatnot, much like Gutierrez's study. And that was a factor. And there was, in one case, there was quite a few male teachers in this program, and one of those teachers had been accused by some of the students that did not stay in school of sort of sexual misconduct, not rape, but approaching them for sexual favors. So there was some issues that way. I would say the other factor, teachers, were the kind of rewarding effort versus success. So you get an A on a test and you're praised, but if you get a C on a test, you're not praised. That seemed to play out for both males and females, but female students who stayed in school cited with a slightly more frequency being encouraged. So keep going, you're doing well, not just so effort versus success. That seemed to be a factor. And I think with males, there was a pretty significant difference between the time spent in school before joining AEPs. So again, less time, especially for male students, seemed to be correlated with dropout. More time seemed to be correlated with persistence. So those were some of the issues that we were able to identify.
Thanks, Neil. And I think probably all of us could speak to the gender dynamics, and maybe I'll turn to Danny and Daniel to share a little bit from our study in response to this question. And then if others, Youssef, Gautier, Samuel, and Francis as well, if you'd like to come in around this. I think there were a few different questions around gender. So Danny, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Mary. In our study in South Sudan and Uganda, we definitely saw different gender dynamics for both teacher and learner well-being in the accelerated education programs. I think, again, this holds true both for teachers and learners, but in many of these settings, and when we think in our conceptual framework about the roles, right, that women and girls might be expected to take on, especially in the home, there's often additional responsibilities related to caregiving, child rearing, domestic chores that are sometimes in tension with fulfilling their roles as learners or teachers. And we heard both from the accelerated education youth and female teachers that we interviewed that when they weren't able to complete their tasks as students or as teachers, it was frustrating, demotivating, and often made them feel stressed. And many times that heavy workload at home and the competing priorities that female learners and teachers faced in their home often prevented them from carrying out their roles. Another important, maybe more teacher-specific point that I wouldn't say is necessarily gendered, but it certainly affected female teachers as well. And I just think is a really important point is that teachers were not paid sufficiently to meet their own or their family's basic needs. And this tension also in not being able to fulfill their role as a provider for their family was a huge source of stress for them. And many female teachers talked about how not being able to care for their families, to buy medicine when a child was sick, to get transport, to visit family outside of perhaps the settlement where they were working was extremely stressful. And also not having those funds, especially we heard from female teachers, to support their own learners who were struggling to buy additional food, to buy soap, to buy other sort of basic necessities was extremely stressful. And then I'll just quickly say before turning it over to Daniel, on the flip side, because those are all obviously things that hindered teacher and learner well-being. On the flip side, we did see, especially in the qualitative data, both from female teachers and learners, real strength in the relationship between female teachers and learners, particularly the learners who were young mothers. Many of the female teachers often took on this expanded role of almost a caretaker for their female learners if they brought their babies to school. We heard many examples of female teachers holding babies during exams and really sort of wanting to take on that role, visiting their female learners in the community, wanting them to come back to school. Even some examples of teachers taking female teachers taking female learners into their homes when they were kicked out of their own homes due to early pregnancy. So on the flip side, there was this strengthened relationship that, despite these difficult circumstances, brought hope and joy. And I think also speaks to sort of the piece Neil was talking about the importance of relationships between teachers and learners when we're thinking about well-being and also staying in school. I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So just to add a few quick points. One is that it was very difficult, I think, for the partners to identify and retain female teachers in South Sudan. So like the proportion of male teachers to female teachers was much less equal there. And that has many reasons that are very contextual. But also just want to highlight some kind of contextual gender dynamics. So, for example, in Uganda, female teachers experience lower overall life satisfaction. This might have to do with the fact that they have to relocate to teach, so they might be quite far away from their family. And that might in some ways take a heavier toll on what they would imagine as a satisfying life due to kind of gendered roles in the family. Whereas the opposite was the case in South Sudan, where there was kind of lower overall life satisfaction among male teachers, and that might have to do with the payment to necessities for living their life was there's a big gap, right? The pay didn't cover their needs, even a greater gap than was in Uganda. And then the other sort of gender dynamic that just to highlight briefly is because this overlapped with COVID, we saw that female teachers were providing more guidance and counseling than male teachers, but on the flip side, male teachers were carrying out more of the home visits, right? And this also has a gender dynamic. So it's a nuanced picture, and the differences are not always where you might expect them as well.
Great. Thank you, Danny and Daniel. Does anyone else want to come in around gender dynamics from their respective study? And if not, I'm going to move to Yusuf. There are several questions for you and around the Somalia context as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll make a comment about gender just now, but let me answer several questions. The one I think is a really good question by Jen. Given the scenarios sketched in our report and the chapter, the question is, what are the models for transitions to more stable employment in challenging contexts? And I think that's a question for all of us. I don't have an immediate answer, but I do think that part of the problem is twofold. The first part of the problem is the fact that the teachers are treated as temporary workers on incentive-based payments. Until that changes and until the funding is not simply whatever its form, the salary in the form of is given by over by NGOs, you're going to struggle to make it a more stable system. Secondly, I think the flip side of that, certainly we noticed that in Ethiopia and Somalia, schools were notwithstanding that contexts of conflict and displacement are protracted, schooling was only provided largely up until the primary school level. Transition beyond primary for many refugees and displaced populations were classified under host community school, and that creates another dynamic and problem as well. So I think, Jen, the answer to it would be to change the system such as to recognize the teachers who themselves are refugees and to recognize their qualification, which requires an agreement between the host government and the refugees in the case of Ethiopia. In Somalia, it was slightly different because the teachers were Somali, but they come from a different part of the region. So it's about the portability of qualifications across different paths and the fact that recognizing this stability over time. That doesn't fully answer the question, but I think it nudges towards that. The second question which came out, which is indirectly, was how can Somali teachers be encouraged to participate in training programs and skills development? That was not in the chat, that was in the chat rather than the Q&A. I think it's an important question. I think implicit in the argument we were making in the chapter in the book, there are three things. One is a recognition of time, to give teachers the time to invest in their professional development and the support and resources to engage in professional development. The second part is to ensure that teachers are involved in determination both of their needs and the form and format of the training. The third is to create a system in which professional development is integrated more broadly with teacher governance. And I think that partly also then touches back on Jen's question. I think the third question, which I think is an interesting one to look at, is what is the role of teacher unions in crisis context? And yeah, I think that's an important one that we didn't directly address, certainly in Ethiopia and Somalia, but one that matters because the teachers in Somalia who taught in the camp schools were both Ethiopian teachers and refugee teachers. So the Ethiopian teachers were national teachers who technically could be members of the Ethiopian teacher unions. And here there's a bigger issue of how you get teachers who are refugees and teachers who are national, for example, to work and combine in unions. And I think that's about going back, Emma, to the question about giving teachers voice, but the voice also must give teachers who work in refugee camps or displaced community context the right to organize and the right to associate. And that's a key point. Just a small point, Mary, then I think I covered all of them, is gender was a focus of the study in Ethiopia and Somalia, including in learning. And for example, when you disaggregate learner scores on sex of learners, boys perform better than girls, for example. And that's, again, points to the need both in terms of the way in which things are being taught in schools, but also teachers' attitudes towards girls, as well as teacher development around gender. Mary, I think I'll hand back because I think that covers the questions. I hope I haven't missed any. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Yusuf. I just was going to add maybe 2 quick points to some of the things that you said, and then I'm going to go to Samuel for a question. So interestingly, in the Oxfam-led consortium, Education International was one of the partners there. And one of their really important contributions was that they worked with South Sudanese stakeholders to create a teachers union as part of that effort. And I've had the pleasure of since collaborating with that teachers union on work around teacher compensation in South Sudan. And so I think it's really interesting, to your point, Yusuf, the right to organize needs to be upheld. And that right and the larger umbrella of inclusion around membership within teachers unions also needs to extend to the myriad profiles of teachers working in these spaces. Because oftentimes there can be a disconnect between maybe kind of the quote unquote national teachers and how they're perceiving the professional development or the career trajectories of refugee teachers. But I said on a webinar that Danny and I did recently, actually on teacher management, like the umbrella is big enough, right, to hold and to advocate for those different profiles of teachers. So I think that's important. And then just lastly, there's an effort underway to create an emergency fund specifically for teacher compensation. That is a recommendation that's come out of the United Nations high-level panel for the teaching profession. And again, EI and other actors are in the process of kind of gathering information and doing a study and a donor mapping, which will kick off in 2025 to better understand how that might work and what kinds of challenges might come up and how they could be overcome and what role this could provide. Amidst the challenges of consistently paying teachers livable wages. So I think there's not excellent models yet to cite, but I think there's a lot more attention and agitation in this direction. And I think the next few years will be interesting to see, what kind of conversation we're having between now and then. So Amika had a question. I'm gonna kick this over to Samuel, which was kind of reminding us, right? Who should bear the most responsibility in ensuring support of students and teachers during crisis contexts? Is it the government? Is it international actors, others? And what kind of checks and balances do we need to place and guarantee these actors are committed to that responsibility? So Samuel, over to you.
Ok, merci beaucoup Marie pour la parole que vous m'accordez. Pour répondre à cette question, je dois dire que ce sont les gouvernements qui ont la première responsabilité de pouvoir accompagner les enseignants, les étudiants dans des contextes de l'éducation en situation d'urgence, étant donné que ce sont les gouvernements qui savent bien quel type de citoyens ils doivent former et en premier lieu, quels sont les gens qui doivent être formés et le besoin du gouvernement par rapport à cela. Les autres acteurs comme les organisations internationales et d'autres peuvent venir après juste pour appuyer parce que si on doit tout laisser aux organisations internationales, on est bien dans un cadre d'urgence alors qu'on a besoin aussi d'agir d'une manière durable pour que tout soit fait dans des conditions correctes et qui puissent aider le gouvernement à pouvoir lutter contre les problèmes qui font qu'il y ait régulièrement éducation en situation d'urgence. Et comment on peut vérifier cela? Il y a le gouvernement développe souvent des outils qui vont permettre de développer le suivi, l'accompagnement. Et avec cela, en conjuguant les efforts, un travail en synergie permet que l'on puisse trouver des solutions à ce genre de problèmes. Voilà la réponse que je peux apporter à cette question. Si Gauthier a un autre élément à ajouter, il peut peut-être rajouter, mais c'est ça ma façon de voir les choses par rapport à cela. Le premier responsable, c'est le gouvernement. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Samuel. Je vais peut-être juste traduire très brièvement et peut-être vous renvoyer une question sur le rôle des acteurs comme l'ISP de Bukavu et les différents instituts qui travaillent et existent dans ces zones-là dans un instant. Parce que je pense que c'est intéressant aussi de comprendre leur rôle. So just to translate very quickly, Professor Samuel Matabishi was saying that the primary and major responsibility lies in governments, that international organizations and international actors can play a role, but their role is relative to emergency and there needs to be long-term solutions which need to be provided centrally by the government. And so that is Samuel Matabishi's reply. I asked if maybe he could elaborate a little bit more on the role of teacher training institutes or education actors that are situated in these conflict-affected areas, how he conceives that role. Professeur Matabishi, si vous pouvez nous dire un peu quel est le rôle, par exemple, en prenant l'exemple de l'Institut supérieur pédagogique, mais aussi d'autres instituts ou d'autres acteurs de l'éducation qui travaillent depuis des années déjà dans ces zones de guerre. Comment est-ce que vous concevez leur rôle?
Merci beaucoup. Les instituts supérieurs pédagogiques et d'autres acteurs comme Cluster Éducation, ils ont un rôle important à jouer parce que ce sont des établissements de formation des formateurs. Ils récupèrent une expérience, une large expérience des enseignants qui travaillent dans ces conditions. Et c'est d'ailleurs grâce à cela que nous avons établi le module de formation des enseignants sur la gestion des conflits en classe, à l'école et dans les milieux environnants, étant donné que ces formateurs, lorsqu'ils diffusent l'information, lorsqu'ils se présentent dans une situation, ils donnent beaucoup plus de, je vais dire, d'informations, et l'information donnée par un enseignant avec toute sa crédibilité, elle est prise au sérieux qu'une information donnée par un politicien. Parce que dans le village, on croit beaucoup à l'enseignant, mais on ne croit pas beaucoup à un politicien qui vient donner des leçons, tandis que l'enseignant qui vit avec la population, qui vit dans la population, qui vit la même situation avec la population, il donne beaucoup plus d'intérêt et il attire beaucoup plus l'attention des populations, et ce que dit l'enseignant passe mieux. Et donc, le rôle des ISP est d'aider, de former, je dirais même de donner beaucoup plus de poids à l'information. Et grâce à cela, on peut, si on envoie sur le terrain beaucoup d'enseignants bien formés, cela donne beaucoup de chances à ce que l'information soit bien prise en compte et bien perçue que lorsqu'elle est donnée par quelqu'un d'autre qui viendrait de notre système, de notre secteur. Voilà le rôle des ISP par rapport à cette zone, par rapport à la gestion des conflits dans les milieux. Former les formateurs qui vont avoir des connaissances à transmettre aux gens pour savoir lutter contre les conflits. Je vais m'arrêter par là pour que Gauthier ait le temps de traduire pour les autres. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Professor. So yes, so Professor Samuel Matabishi was reflecting on the role of these in the DRC Institut Supérieur Pédagogique. So these are the teacher training institutes in the DRC, but teacher training institutes in conflict-affected areas more broadly, and saying that they aggregate and they concentrate this experience and this knowledge of teachers who work and live in these conflict-affected contexts. And then they also obviously train teachers, but that speaks to a more important role of education in the conflict-affected areas, which is, he highlighted that the teachers are listened to more than the politicians are. People trust the teachers much more than the politicians. And this is something that is actually crucial. So Professor Matabishi highlighted that, the social position of these teachers and the trust and the role that it can play in these conflict-affected contexts. I might just add myself that these Instituts Supérieurs Pédagogiques, but also more generally education actors that work in these types of contexts have extremely important institutional memory and knowledge, again, about how to deal with these situations. And I think it's a point that we made during the presentation, but it's crucial to support them and continue partnerships with them. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Merci to Samuel and Gauthier. And we're about out of time. There was one final question that is, and thank you, Neil, for answering it in the Q&A, that Anya, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, asked around the framing of resilience in the book. And obviously, we don't have a lot of time to talk about it now, and Neil nicely answered it. But it's not just about individual resilience, right? It's about individuals and families and communities and larger systems and the interactions across those different levels. And really thinking about taking this more holistic, more socio-ecological approach. And that's the way we kind of tackled it in the book. And in the introduction chapter in the book, we also talk about how resilience can kind of be misused, right? It can be misused to direct the burden and the responsibility on individuals rather than recognize and tackle the structural and systemic barriers that need to be addressed for any of the work that we're trying to do to be sustainable and to achieve the quality learning and well-being outcomes that we strive for. And so unfortunately, we could probably have a whole webinar just on that concept. We're going to have to leave it here. I just want to extend a heartfelt thanks to my colleagues. It's been a pleasure and a privilege collaborating with you as we brought this book to life. So thank you so much for that opportunity. We hope that others will get access to it and will help you do that. So get in touch and that it will be helpful to your work. And we're certainly, going to continue the conversation. And so finally, I guess a huge thanks to INEE for hosting today's webinar and for recording it and making the resources available after today. And I just, in closing, wishing everyone kind of happy holidays for those who are celebrating, a very happy new year, and one that we hope brings resolutions to the conflicts that continue to affect so many around the world and more peaceful futures. So thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your day or evening. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.